On TV, on radio, and on your smartphone. This is Talk TV.
Tonight on Piers Morgan Uncensored, an exclusive one-on-one interview with the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, a man who's flown right across the world to be here in London for the coronation of King Charles III, which might strike you as a little odd, given he's a die-hard Republican who wants to get rid of the head of state in his country being a member of our royal family. He also wants to get rid of the monarchy. I sit down with Albanese for a long, wide-ranging interview, and we talk about the royals, about the monarchy, about whether he'll take an oath of allegiance to the king at the service on Saturday. We also talk about other big pressing world issues: China, Taiwan, America. Is Biden too old to be president? Should Trump be allowed to run again now he's been indicted? We talk cancel culture, wokery, Dame Edna Everage. It's an extraordinary interview that ends in a remarkable way with some of the most personal revelations I think I've ever got from any world leader that tell the full, amazing story of this man's journey. And the interview ends in a remarkable way with the Prime Minister revealing extraordinary personal details about his journey to become the most powerful man in Australia. The story of his mother, the father he thought was dead, a reunion in Italy, and a very touching deathbed scene. This is an interview with a world leader like few others. Anthony Albanese, one-on-one. Well, Prime Minister, welcome to Britain.
Good to be with you and great to be in London.
I have a strict rule, I have to confess, normally. I don't fraternise with any Australians in the run-up to an Ashes series, but I have made an exception for you.
Well, it's going to be a cracker of a series and hopefully will go well.
Any prediction?
I always think we're going to win. Even when we were rubbish, I thought we were going to win. You've got to back your team.
A legendary Australian cricketer, Keith Miller, who flew with your Air Force in World War II, was once asked about pressure, and he said, pressure is having a Messerschmitt up your bleep. You've been Prime Minister not even a year yet. How's it going? I mean, just the reality, when I last saw you, you were contesting the federal election, and you've been a career politician, but this moment now, this period, what's it been like for you?
Well, I'm enjoying it. It's an incredible privilege and an honour to be the Prime Minister of a country that I love dearly, and one that I think is the greatest country on earth with respect to the UK, but I think can be even greater in the future.
You're here for our coronation of King Charles III. How do you feel about that? You're a lifelong Republican. What are you doing here, Prime Minister?
Well, I think you can be a lifelong Republican, which I am, and still respect our institutions. And certainly I have a great deal of respect for King Charles. I am having an audience with him this afternoon, and I'm very much looking
Me in the morning, the King in the afternoon. I like the way your schedule's going, Prime Minister.
I'm very much looking forward to it. I had a terrific meeting with him at the Palace when I was here for his mother's funeral. That was a real moment of reflection. That was an extraordinary time. And it's a great honour to be here representing Australia. All Australians wish King Charles well, regardless of the different views that people will have about our constitutional arrangements.
The Queen, you were here for the funerals, you said, and you actually went to her lying in state at Westminster Hall. What was that experience like for you?
It was very moving. I mean, the Queen Elizabeth was, of course, the only head of state in my lifetime up to that point. And she was a constant in our lives, a reassuring presence. So her passing was something that was a very significant event. But she also, I think, was very loved and respected by all. To lead your nation and the Commonwealth for 7 decades is extraordinary. We won't see that. Certainly you and I won't see that again. And I think people, the queues, as we went running one morning along the Thames, and the queues of people, including Australians who had travelled to London in order to queue for 36 hours to pay their respects to Her Majesty lying in state, was a remarkable time.
When you were standing there with your partner and you were paying your own personal respects, did you feel emotional in that moment, notwithstanding your long-held position about the monarchy?
Well, it's a moment in history. I had the great honour of, I met Queen Elizabeth at the palace during the first G20 that was held during the global financial crisis. And her leadership and her capacity, her strength was quite remarkable, and her passing was a very significant moment in the world's history. And unlike even previous monarchs, of course, she came to that position at such a young age, and during the era, the first era of television, modern communications, so the pressure that she was under during those 7 decades, of course, grew, and she carried herself with such dignity and grace during that entire period.
Your birth was actually delayed because of the Queen.
Well,
true, right?
My mother was, well, kind of true. My mother was on her way to the hospital in 1963, and the Queen was, of course, visiting Australia, and my mother insisted on going through the streets and seeing the banners and the commemorations for her visit on the way to give birth to me. So that was my mum, and that is something, that is an example. My mother voted yes in the Republic, but she had enormous respect for Her Majesty the Queen.
This question of what happens to Australia, whether it becomes a republic, is obviously, it's not going to go away. Many people think it's inevitable. Hugh Jackman was recently quoted, one of your great national heroes, saying it's inevitable. You voted in the 1999 referendum in favour of a republic and said it's inevitable. Everybody accepts that. But that referendum came back 55% against, 45% saying yes to a republic. My first question, are you going to have another referendum while you're Prime Minister?
My sole priority that I've put forward for constitutional change is to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our constitution, and to listen to them through a voice, what's called a voice, essentially that they be consulted on matters that affect them. And that's a referendum that will hold between October and December. That's my timetable. I'm not looking beyond that. I think that Australia should have an Australian as our head of state. I don't shy away from that. I haven't changed my views. But my priority is constitutional recognition. I can't imagine going forward, for example, as has been suggested by some legitimately, that we should be having another referendum on the Republic. Before that occurs, for me, the absolute priority is that recognition.
Right, but once you've done that, it would be odd for somebody who's such a die-hard Republican as you, notwithstanding your respect for the key players in the royal family and the monarchy, which you've shown in this interview already. Notwithstanding that, it would be very odd, wouldn't it, if you were a Prime Minister and you didn't want another referendum? I mean, otherwise, what's been the point of posing it all this time?
Well, look, I think at some stage in the future that will occur.
Would you like it to happen under your tenure?
What I don't want to do is to be a Prime Minister who presides over just constitutional debates. And
they're big debates.
And that's why they are, but so's dealing with the challenge of climate change, getting an economy that works for people, making more things in Australia, engaging in our region to restore our relationships is one of the tasks that I've had as Prime Minister. So I've said quite clearly that that's my priority. You'll know because there'll be a feeling from the bottom up as well, a demand for another vote isn't something that can be imposed from the top because it won't be successful. When that demand is there, I'm sure a vote will be held.
How close to that feeling do you think Australia is? Because the polls have been all over the place.
I don't see it as being imminent.
But if you were to win a second term, potentially you could have a referendum.
Well, I don't see it as being imminent.
You're being very diplomatic here, Prime Minister. Is that because you're here for a monarchy, which many of your supporters would be like, well, hang on, you've come here to London to watch a king being crowned at the head of an institution that you just don't agree with?
No, but part of the job of being the Australian Prime Minister is to represent all Australians, not just to put forward my own views, which are clearly there, but it is important that the Australian Prime Minister and the Governor-General and all of the governors, and we have some prominent Australians coming along as well on Saturday. Sam Kerr, great footballer. She will be the flag bearer on Saturday, and I chose her, put her forward. I thought that was a really appropriate thing to do. Someone who's a young, dynamic Australian sportswoman who hopefully will lead us to World Cup glory in the Women's World Cup that's coming up, being hosted in Australia in a couple of months' time.
So what are you going to do in Westminster Abbey when you are urged to say the oath of allegiance to King Charles?
I do that every term.
No, I know, but are you going to say it in the Abbey with the world's cameras watching?
I will do what's entirely appropriate as the representative of Australia, which is Australians made a choice in 1999. And one of the things that you've got to do is to accept democratic outcomes. So we made that choice, and I will certainly engage in that spirit.
So you will say the oath?
As I have done 10 times when
I
I get sworn into Parliament. Yes.
But just to be clear, in the Abbey, there's been confusion over whether you will. As the Prime Minister of Australia, in the Abbey, on Saturday, you will say the oath.
As the Prime Minister of Australia, it's expected that I will do that. But that doesn't mean, of course, that Australians don't have a wide range of views. And it's also the case that as Australian Prime Minister, I'm accountable to the Australian people. I mean, that's who I serve, and I have that great honour.
Do you know the words?
To?
The oath.
Well, I know the oath that I give in the in Parliament each time.
I swear that I will pay true allegiance to your Majesty and to your heirs and successors according to law, so help me God. There's been a lot of actually, I would say a lot of kickback here about this entreaty, which has come from the Archbishop of Canterbury. The public, the British public, and a wider world, of course, including those in the Commonwealth, should all crowd round their TV sets and recite this. Because, as people have pointed out, heirs and successors, well, that could be, if we're unlucky, Prince Andrew, or, God forbid, Harry and Meghan.
Well, people will make their own decisions on Saturday, but I think it will be a very significant historic event.
The Australian Republican movement, the Australian Republic movement, has called on all Australians to pledge allegiance to Australians and Australian values on Coronation Day and not, quote, obey the absurd request of King Charles for us to pledge fealty to him and his heirs and successors. As a Republican from Australia, what's your message to them?
I pledge allegiance to the Australian people each and every day. And that's our democratic system that we have. And it's one, I think people will have these views. But I think that
But they're your views.
Absolutely. I pledge my allegiance to the Australian people. They are the people I'm accountable for.
But are you at all worried tomorrow that your Republican people back in Australia, the side that you actually agree with, they're going to see you on Saturday declaring your oath of allegiance
No.
to not just King Charles, but to all his heirs and successors,
No.
when actually, really what you want to do is get rid of the monarchy? I mean, it is a strange conundrum, right?
No. Our position, the position of the Australian Republican movement isn't about getting rid of the monarchy. That's a decision for the UK. The decision of the ARM is that an Australian should be the Australian head of state.
Yeah.
And that's what I agree with. I think you would do that, but Australia would, I would hope, continue to be involved in the Commonwealth. But I'm of the view that an Australian should be our head of state.
There's a new poll out today about the British public's view of this. Overwhelming support for the monarchy. 2/3 said it may seem a strange system in this day and age, but it works. And that's kind of my view about this. I mean, I feel uneasy about this oath, to be honest. I won't be saying it the way they want me to, because I'm not going to commit to having allegiance to Prince Andrew and Prince Harry. But there's an interesting statement there by the public, which is they know it's a bit anachronistic. We know it's kind of weird to have people in palaces not paying proper taxes and all. Of course we do. And yet the British public feel quite strongly the overriding benefits of a monarchy outweigh the negatives.
And that's the right of the British people to determine. That's the point I'm making here, I guess, as someone who supports an Australian head of state. We should determine who our head of state is, and the United Kingdom should determine who their head of state is.
You don't have a view about the actual institution of the monarchy?
Well, I'm not a monarchist.
So you would get rid of it?
Well, we don't have an Australian royal family. That's the point here.
But you have one of our royal family as your head of state.
Exactly, but that's the point, because that's a contradiction in itself. That's why I think Australia should have our own head of state, and I'm of the view that I think that should be an appointed head of state. There should be some process whereby our democratically elected institutions in the House of Representatives and the Senate have a say in that. There's various models. That's one of the things that's held back the change in Australia, is the failure to agree on a way forward. But I would hope that Australia would still, of course, remain a member of the Commonwealth. I mean, Australia has...
Can an undemocratic monarchy really exist going forward? Go forward 10, 20, 30 years. We've seen the rapid removal of most monarchies in Europe in the last 50 years or so. I mean, do you think that a monarchy, the idea, the concept, has any real future?
Well, that's a matter for the United Kingdom. I myself am a Democrat and believe in democratic institutions, and that is how we should be governed, and that is how we should determine.
So you don't believe in the idea of a monarchy?
State. No, I'm a Republican.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that I don't respect the institution which is there, which plays a role in our system of government. I have to meet with the Governor-General regularly. The Governor-General has to sign off on our pieces of legislation, and I respect that. And I think that it's important that institutions which are there, that have been determined, be given that respect. And I see my role as the Australian Prime Minister in doing that.
When you see the King later, how are you going to explain that you've decided to remove his image or not have his image on your $5 banknotes, given it's always traditionally been whoever the monarch is? You've decided as a government you're not going to do this. Are you going to cough up to this when you see King Charles?
I'm sure that it won't be raised. The King's portrait, the official one, will be on the back of every coin. And of course, our dollar notes, the truth is that they've all changed at various times as well, including the $5 note. So this was, I think, much ado about nothing, frankly.
Except you've always had the Queen's...
No, it hasn't always been on the $5 note.
Really?
That's actually not true. And indeed, we haven't even had... We've had different currencies, of course. We went decimal in 1966. So there's a whole history of change.
So nothing personal then?
Not at all. Not at all. The decision was made actually by the Reserve Bank wasn't even made by the government, an independent body. They consulted the government, and we were comfortable with the decision that was made to have an Indigenous representation artwork on the $5 note, which of course, with the $1 note that was abolished, that used to have, so the lowest denomination of note, of currency, used to have the Indigenous artwork on it.
Meghan and Harry have dominated headlines for 3 years. Do you have a view about them? Do you think they should be able to keep their royal titles?
I have, of all the things that come across my desk that I'm concerned about, global inflation, the increasingly insecure world, the war in Ukraine, dealing with the challenge of climate change, I've got to say, Harry and Meghan have not been front and centre of my thoughts.
Will you be seeking Harry out in the Abbey for a little chat?
I spoke to Harry very briefly at his mother's funeral.
His grandmother.
His grandmother, sorry, and passed on my respects. And I don't know whether I'll see him or not, but if I did, I'd say hello.
Australia's other queen, Dame Edna Everage, very sadly died. Barry Humphries, who created that amazing comic character. What were your thoughts about Barry Humphries? Just
that Barry Humphries was the quintessential Australian character. Barry Humphries brought Australian larrikinism really to life. And in the characters, including, of course, most famously Dame Edna, but Sandy Stone and of course,
Les
who
Patterson.
can forget that great Australian politician, Les Patterson. Australians have a particular sense of humour. I think British humour is different from American humour. I'm a fan of Monty Python going back, and Blackadder and shows like that could only have come from the UK. Barry Humphries could only have come from Australia. What Barry Humphries would say is taking the piss out of ourselves. And he did it so well and for such a long period of time. So it was a big loss for the Australian arts community, and of course he was equally as big here in the United Kingdom. And it says something about our common history that we share, and that engagement and interaction. I don't know that Barry Humphries was very big in the United States or in Asia or in continental Europe, but in the United Kingdom he was big, and in Australia he was, of course, larger than life, and there was a great deal of mourning of him.
His comedy, rather light, actually Monty Python, Blackadder, all those kind of shows, which I love too, almost certainly wouldn't survive the modern curse of cancel culture because of the inappropriateness, apparently. Barry Humphries was cancelled by the Melbourne International Comedy Show. They took his name off the top award for him being allegedly transphobic. What did you feel about that?
Well, I wasn't even aware of that, I must say, until recent times. And I think people legitimately can put forward their concerns about someone's comments that were made then. But at the same time, I think that we've got to be able to laugh at ourselves. I think that a lot of humour, you're quite right, that a lot of humour that used to be on, I mean, Fawlty Towers, I'm not sure how that would go.
Never make it.
I'm not sure how that would go at the moment.
We now have. This whole idea of cancel
culture. And I think there were only, I think there were 12 episodes of Fawlty Towers, and they were fantastic. They were good fun, and they weren't, in my view, today you look at it and you go, maybe you might do it differently. But a bit like rewriting some books, it is what it is at the time, and it's the that's the context. And I think that the idea of cancel culture is, in my view, a sad development, because you often can get as well pylons in social media, and you see it happen so often, and things quite often too, taken out of context. I mean, I try not to look at too much social media, but I know that sometimes people will say something to me about an answer that in an interview like this, without people having seen the question or what was said before or afterwards, and make it look like something that it isn't. But I think that we need far more...
Should the Melbourne Comedy...
Far more tolerance.
Should the Melbourne International Comedy Institution, I guess they would call themselves, but should they have cancelled someone like Barry Humphries? Or did it actually, was that the worst kind of cancel culture? Because now, since he died, they've now said we want to pay homage to him and honour him, which seems to me stinking hypocrisy.
Well, I'm not going to go into the past because I wasn't a part of, I wasn't even aware that occurred. But I'll say this, that it's good that a tribute is now being made to Barry Humphries, and there will be a state funeral for Barry Humphries as well, co-hosted by the New South Wales and the Victorian government and the Australian government. My government will be a part of that as well.
So you won't be cancelling
paying tribute. No, we'll be paying tribute to him at a state funeral. He's someone who has gave an enormous amount of pleasure to generations of Australians, and I know that a range of people who are friends of mine knew him very well. I didn't. I met him on one occasion briefly, but I didn't know him. But I know how warmly he was regarded by people in Australia and in the UK.
The issue that got him into hot water was this issue of gender identity. He was defending J.K. Rowling. The New Zealand Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, was asked to define a woman, and he said, well, people identify for themselves. He couldn't answer, and it was excruciating to watch, to be honest with you. And this has been a sort of hot potato question for world leaders. Some of them seem incapable, including Keir Starmer here. What is a woman, Prime Minister?
An adult female.
How difficult was that to answer?
Not too hard. I was asked during the campaign, actually, but I think that we need to. I think I respect people for whoever they are, and it's up to people to to be respected, and I know that there is some controversy can come at times like that, and I'm not a fan of some of the campaign. There was recently a very controversial visit in Australia that was designed to stir up issues, and people who are, young people coming to terms with their identity and who they are. I think that they need to be respected as well.
Well, what would you do, for example, with this issue of transgender athletes in women's sport, which many world sporting authorities are now beginning to move to exclude them because they say it's simply not fair? Well,
that's an example in that the sporting organisations are dealing with that issue.
What's your view?
My view is the sporting organisations should deal with that issue.
Does it seem fair to you that people who were born biologically male with all the physical advantage should be able to compete against people born with female biology?
Well, in Australia, the sporting codes are able to deal with that, and they have effectively, and they've done so in a way in which during the last campaign, there was one of the candidates chosen who tried to make that front and centre, that issue. I've got to say, as I've gone around and, my son played junior sport for both football, as in soccer, and Australian rules football and cricket and everything. None of these issues ever came up, and I don't think they're front and centre.
That's because it wasn't happening then.
Well,
you didn't get biological males competing against biological women. I mean, that's the problem with it. To me, I can support transgender rights to fairness and equality, but right to the point where they infringe on women's rights. I mean, they've got to also have fairness and equality.
And that's why sporting codes should be dealing with it.
Yeah, but you're the Prime Minister of Australia. You must have a view.
No, that's why sporting codes... That's my view.
Are you ducking it?
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm saying that what it shouldn't be done is done to try to politicise an issue that should be made on its merits based upon the proper assessment of whether it's fair or not, but done in a way as well that doesn't seek to essentially target a very vulnerable group. And that's my concern.
Well, I don't think they should be demonised in any way.
And that's my concern as well.
I get that, but I think there are serious issues which have to be addressed.
Of course they are, but it should be done without the targeting of a vulnerable group of people, and that's my view, that people should be respected. The sporting codes are dealing with it. And what occurred when this debate happened in Australia is the sporting codes said themselves, we're dealing with this. We don't need this to be politicised, and we don't need politicians buying into it.
You're going to see Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, while you're here. Are you going to mention that you've just been in a poll named the third most popular global leader while he languishes at number 10, and that you also made Time magazine's 100 most influential people? And in fact, the Prime Minister of Australia and in fact the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, said that you were effectively a progressive champion around the world. I mean, it's been a good couple of months for you, Prime Minister.
Prime Minister Trudeau was very generous in his comments. I wasn't aware that I had been named or that he was writing the citation until it was pointed out to me by the media. I did send him a little message saying thank you for his generous comments, and I am looking forward to seeing him again on the weekend. He, of course, will be here at the Coronation as the leader of another Commonwealth country. As for the first, that's the first I've heard of it, but I won't be raising that with Rishi Sunak. This is my third meeting with him, and we'll be talking about the free trade agreement that can make an enormous difference for Australia and for the UK, about how we can have mutual benefit from increased economic engagement. And of course, we'll also be talking about our AUKUS arrangements, further strengthening the cooperation when it comes to our defence.
One of your predecessors, Paul Keating, wasn't exactly complimentary about the AUKUS arrangement. He described your $368 billion deal for the nuclear submarines as the worst deal in history. Said you could have had 40 to 50 conventional subs instead. He also attacked you for working with the UK. Said after the great problem of Brexit, after that fool Johnson, Boris, destroyed their place in Europe, they're going to put together global Britain. So they're looking around for suckers. Are you a sucker, Prime Minister?
The AUKUS arrangement, to me, should surprise no one. Australia, if you look at our history, we have 65,000 of proud history. The oldest continuous culture on earth is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. But then we have the relationship with Britain, and that's a relationship that goes back to 1788, to the First Fleet. And ever since then, we have stood side by side as great democratic nations. Our parliament takes the Westminster system as the basis of our democracy. And we have common interests, of course, since the Second World War, in particular, under Labor's Prime Minister John Curtin. We turned to the United States. Ever since then, the United States has been our most critical alliance partner. So getting greater cooperation between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States, not just in Australia being able to build our own nuclear-powered submarines, is, to my mind, a very sensible thing to do in today's uncertain world. And I know former Prime Minister Keating made some colourful comments I have every respect for Paul, but on this, I just disagree with him.
Was Brexit a good idea?
That was a matter for the United Kingdom.
So was it a good idea?
Well, as the Australian Prime Minister, I don't see it as my place to put forward matters which are strictly a matter for the people and the government of the United Kingdom.
One of the big reasons for AUKUS, of course, is the ongoing threat of China potentially invading Taiwan. Paul Keating said this: "I dare the Prime Minister to explicitly suggest or leave open the question that Australia might go to war over Taiwan at the urgings of the United States or anyone else." So, I dare you to answer that question, Prime Minister.
Well, I want a region that is peaceful, that is secure, that is stable, and that is prosperous. And that's what we're working towards. But one of the ways that we're also engaging in the region is by lifting up our national security. We don't apologise for that. We have the AUKUS arrangements. We've just had our Defence Strategic Review as well to look at what are the capabilities that Australia needs and where do we need them.
But do you think China may invade Taiwan as many do?
Well, I don't think it is constructive to speculate on matters like that. We support the status quo when it comes to Taiwan.
Would you support Taiwan if they were invaded?
Taiwan is not assisted by people speculating on hypotheticals. We support.
Well, President Biden has. He's already said that America would support them.
We support the status quo being maintained. We support stability in the region, and we're investing in our capability. But we're investing in something else as well. We're investing in our relationships, whether it's AUKUS, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's our Pacific friends through the Pacific relationships that we have, rebuilding them. But also, we're engaging in the region. My government hasn't engaged in rhetoric that is inflammatory. What we've said with regard to China is that we will cooperate where we can, we'll disagree where we must, and we'll engage in our national interest.
But you wouldn't just sit back, would you?
So
you wouldn't sit back if Taiwan was invaded. You wouldn't sit back as Australia's Prime Minister and just do nothing.
I don't see it as constructive to speculate on hypotheticals. What's important, and the role of peace and security and stability in the region is advanced by having a very clear position, which is support for the status quo of no unilateral action by either side in those issues. And our position on China has been to engage constructively, but to continue to put forward that the impediments to trade should be removed, to say very directly to President Xi that Australians such as Cheng Li need to be given proper justice and that they're not receiving that at the moment, and to raise those issues, to raise human rights issues. So we don't shy away from that, but we do so in a way that's constructive and respectful, and that's how you advance diplomacy. That's how you advance positive outcomes.
OK, President Biden said he's running again for office in 2024. He would be 82 and he'd be 86 at the end of a second term. Is he too old?
That's a matter for the United States, but I don't believe that...
Do you want to be Prime Minister at 86?
Anyway, we'll see how I go. We'll see how I go.
That will have sent a shiver down your opponent's spine.
But can I say this about President Biden? I think he is doing an extraordinary job. I regard him as a friend of mine. I regard him as an important leader of our most important ally. I'll be welcoming President Biden to Australia this month for the Quad Leaders meeting. And he, through his actions, not just in international relations, where he is strengthening the United States' engagement in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, that's something that we welcome.
You don't think he's too old?
We
In your
welcome.
dealings with him, you don't get a feeling of a
Not
guy...
at all. Not at all. He is totally on top of his brief. He's someone who's very conscious about regional affairs in the Indo-Pacific region. He's someone who's engaged with our friends in ASEAN. I notice today he has the leader of the Philippines, Bongbong Marcos, there hosting him in the White House.
He's also got to engage with potentially Donald Trump if Trump wins the Republican nomination. President Trump is actually in Britain at the moment. Are you going to hook up with him? Are you going to...
No. I engage with President Biden. I look forward to meeting him.
Would you be happy to engage with Trump if he was to win the White House back?
Our relationship with the United States is a relationship between countries and between peoples based upon our common democratic values.
You'd have no problem dealing with Donald Trump if he won?
Well, it's not up to me to determine...
No, but you wouldn't have any trouble dealing with it?
No,
if he was president.
I'll deal with whoever, the president or the prime minister,
even if he's facing,
or the leader of
he's been indicted on
country.
criminal charges.
That's a matter for.
You comfortable with that?
That's a matter for the people of the United States, and I have no intention of interfering in their internal political processes. I expressed my concern.
Would an Australian Prime Minister, do you think, be able to, or would an Australian politician be able to run to be Prime Minister if they were indicted on committing crimes?
Well, they would, I think, speculating on that, in terms of either a Labor or a Liberal candidate would, I think, have issues if that occurred. But look, I said very clearly, I expressed my concern about the events that occurred in the capital on January 6th. I don't shy from that. I think democracy is a precious commodity. A whole lot of the world, it's under threat. And that's why we need to support our democracy, including supporting our democratic institutions.
Russell Crowe has part-owned the South Sydney Rabbitohs, the rugby league club, and you're a big fan of them. He's known you a long time.
A former board member.
Right, so he said this about you. With all the opaque bullshit we've had to deal with for the last 10 or 15 years, we've got a guy, you, who is at least going to tell us the truth. Now, he might not make the decisions that you want individually every time, but over time, what Anthony will do is improve the lives of the people in this country. And he also said you never asked him for anything, unlike everybody else. That's a pretty good review coming from Russell Crowe. I shouldn't think he suffers fools gladly. He thinks you're an honest person. You may make mistakes, you might get things wrong, but essentially you're an honest person.
And I am. And one of the things that I've done as Prime Minister is to say things the way that I see them. So we've got a budget coming up next week. Now, we'll do a number of measures to assist people with the cost of living, but we can't do everything on day one. I haven't been in office for a year yet, and it follows almost a decade of, I think, a government that was characterised by inaction and delay and denial, that we were left with $1 trillion of debt. So we've explained that, but we have fulfilled the commitments that we made in the lead up to the election to the best of our capacity. But of course, all governments and all individuals, including myself, will make mistakes from time to time.
Are you unafraid to admit when you're wrong? I'll give an example. The small boats policy, which is a big issue here, big issue in Australia, what you do with people who wash up on your shores. You were very opposed to it and you changed your mind.
Correct.
Is that political expediency, the reality?
No, it's looking at the facts the way that they are and being upfront about it.
But you said this in 2015. I couldn't ask someone else to do something I couldn't see myself doing. If people were in a boat, including families and children, I myself couldn't turn that around. But now you can. What changed?
The facts I didn't think that...
well, you still get people,
at the
families
time,
and kids turning up in boats. Right? I mean, that's still happening.
and they have been turned around.
But are you comfortable with
At the time, yes, because if you look at what happened in practice with boat turnbacks, the view of what was occurring was that the advice to us when we were in government that if you tried to do that, then they'd scuttle the boats and it would result in tragedies. So the fact is, though, that the boat turnbacks policy was a part of something that did make a difference. I support an orderly migration program. I have said that you can be strong on borders without being weak on humanity. So one of the things that my government has done, because we have ensured that the boats, contrary to what the Conservatives said before the election campaign, I must say some of the media as well said, oh, well, if Labor's elected, the boats will start and it'll all start back. That hasn't happened. We have kept in place strong border security measures, but we also have an increasingly humane policy. So, for example, that the people who had arrived and were in limbo for more than 10 years on temporary protection visas, who no government was going to send back to Iran or to Afghanistan, we have said that they should be entitled to permanent security to become permanent residents as well.
But let me ask you,
so we've abolished those temporary protection
let me
visas.
Ask you, when you're tough on border, you're anti-cancel culture, you know what a woman is, are you sure you're a progressive left? You're not a secret Tory in disguise, eh?
I'm an absolutely consistent
Are you
Labor
Are you an old-fashioned liberal of my kind?
No,
an old-fashioned who actually realises the woke left is pretty nutty. And that way madness lies.
I'm a social democrat who believes in markets, but believes that the state, the power of the state, can make a positive difference to people's lives. That believes that the philosophy I took to the election was two-part. No one held back and no one left behind. No one held back, what does that mean? That people aspiring to a better life for themselves and for their families is a legitimate thing. We need economic growth. We need to, that's why I want to make more things in Australia. That's why I want to lift wages. That's why I want industry policy to kick in. That's why I want to challenge climate change and to tackle it, because we've seen
Will you be talking to the King Charles
impacts.
about that? Because he's obviously been at the forefront of that for many years.
He's had a very strong position in it.
Has he been proven right, King Charles, about the environment and climate change?
He certainly has been. And one of the things about King Charles over a long period of time is that the stance that he has made on climate change, on the urban environment as well, on Indigenous issues, are ones that I think bring him great credit. Now, I won't talk about what I will talk to him about, because the protocol is that remains a private discussion, and we'll have a discussion this afternoon. But I certainly think that his stance on those issues has been very significant. But to go back to, because I don't want to miss the second point about what a Labor Prime Minister does is we don't leave people behind. So we're looking at that in terms of the budget, but we're doing that as well with cheaper childcare to allow greater women's workforce participation. We're dealing with that as well through things like I marched in the Mardi Gras to show my support for inclusiveness, and I'll continue to do that. We are having a referendum to give Indigenous people recognition in our nation's constitution. I think you can do both things, and that's something that my government is focused on achieving. We're only 1 year in to our first term.
Been quite a year, hasn't it?
It's been a very busy year.
Prime Minister, I want to end just with this. I want to show you a picture, because I found this picture and I found it very poignant, and I'm sure you will too. You probably remember the picture. This is a picture on a boat, and this is 1962. And there are two people in that picture. This is the TSS Fair Sky. It was a Sitmar Line boat. Tell me who's in that picture.
Well, it's my mum sitting there on the...
Marianne.
As I see it, Marianne on the far right. She's next to her brother, George, and standing up in white is a dashing fellow who happens to be my father, Carlo, who was a purser on the ship that my mother travelled to on that long journey.
To England?
To England, here, where she lived in London for a while.
And she fell pregnant?
She did. She had a relationship with Carlo, and during, I think, not just on the ship, but clearly from piecing it together...
So you were conceived in England?
When he... Quite likely, that's right.
So you're one of us.
When he visited...
You're English,
I'm still not going for you in the ashes, so don't try that. Don't try that on.
But you accept you could have been conceived in this country.
That's not going to happen. I think chances are I was.
Yeah.
I think I was here when the ship used to berth at Southampton. And my mum travelled, met him, had a relationship with him, fell pregnant. He was, when she told him he was engaged to someone, the person who became his wife back in Italy. And so she went back to Australia, had me, made the courageous decision in 1963 to be a single mother and to raise me. She was very Catholic. So it was a difficult thing for the family. And at that time...
She was urged to have you adopted.
She was, and that was what was very common at the time.
Your life could have been so different.
It would have been very different. And at the time it was to be that I would be adopted out, and that the story would be told in the local community and in the family that she had got news of my father's death, and that had caused her to the trauma to lose her child. But she couldn't do that. There was a moment where a nun at the hospital knew that she was the sort of person who she just really didn't want that to happen. She was under a bit of pressure. So she brought me into my mum, and my mum was never going to let me go.
What a moment.
I
mean, that's sliding doors.
Oh, absolutely.
Of an incomparable, enormous consequence.
Oh, and she then adopted his name, Albanese.
But continued to pretend that he had died in an accident.
That's right. And I was told
Including to you.
Yeah, I was told that until I was old enough when she felt I could understand.
You were 14, I think.
I was 14, 15, you know.
How did you feel when you found out he's potentially still alive?
Oh, at the time, I mean, I was a pretty tough young kid. We had a difficult upbringing. I mean, my mum had rheumatoid arthritis and was crippled up, was an invalid pensioner. We lived in a council house where she had lived her whole life. My grandparents had died by then. So it was just me and Mum. We didn't have anything economically, but I had her unconditional love, and that was enough for me. And so I said, I'm not interested, you know, that you're enough for me, which is what she needed to hear. So while she was alive, I didn't search for him, but she died in 2002. My son had come along in 2000, and there was a moment where I was at her gravesite, and my little boy was very little, said, you know, where's your daddy? And I sort of realised that, you know, I needed to, and he had a right to hear, understand what had happened. And so I had, I guess, once she passed away, I could then search for him without bringing any sense that she wasn't all I needed. And so I found him in 2009.
Well, it's an amazing story, because this is nearly 40 years later.
Yeah, 46 years later.
I mean, incredible.
I was 46 when we met.
Right, and by pure chance, a friend of yours is now running the ship company that had been renamed several times. It was now
That's
the
right.
Carnival Cruises. You knew this woman, and she helped the search, and they find your dad's old employment card
details
in some dusty, rickety area in Genoa where the original ship's stuff had all been sent.
Yeah.
And from that, you were able, by now, you're a minister, right? Under
That's right. I was a minister in the
Kevin
government.
Rudd. And you're able to track down your dad. And you're in a meeting, or you're in your office, I think, and it's a Thursday, and you get a call from this friend of yours who's running the ship company, and she just says, "We've found him."
It was a remarkable moment. And I was chairing a ministerial council meeting of all the state and territory ministers, so an important meeting that night. And I told my staff to go on without me, and it took my breath away. It was an extraordinary moment.
Well, that's all from Piers Morgan Uncensored tonight. What an extraordinary end to an interview. There can't be many world leaders who've got a more remarkable backstory than Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia. That's all for us tonight. Wherever you are, keep it uncensored. Good night.
Well, coming up on First Edition in an hour's time, she came to London with her parents as migrants from Guyana. She went on to become the first black female cabinet minister and the first ever black principal of an Oxford college. And on Saturday, she has a starring role at the coronation of King Charles. We have an exclusive interview with the wonderful Baroness Valerie Amos. And just 24 hours of campaigning left until the local elections on Thursday. The most important set of elections in years, as it could be the last, before the general election. We'll have the latest on what it all means for Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. All that in an hour's time. Up next, a change in the scheduling. Arthur Edwards and Life with the Royal Family, the documentary.
For the Real Crown experience, tune in to Talk TV all this week for a right royal point of view. Don't miss Piers Morgan,
Very smartly, he's now moving to save the monarchy.
Jeremy Kyle,
It really is a monumental moment, whether you're a monarchist or not.
Vanessa Feltz,
We can't wait, we're counting down, we've got the mug, we've got the bunting.
and TV Queen Mrs O.
He is a humanitarian and he's going to do a great job.
Only on Talk TV.
I've been photographing the same family for 45 years. I followed their lives across 4 generations.
It's a pleasure. Well, wonderful. It wouldn't be the same without you on all these events. You're so kind, sir. I'm so glad you're making a program of this.